So we began this class with a particular year, and that year was 1848. So 1848 was a year of revolution, the springtime of nations, in which the word freedom was on everyone's lips. So I'd like to end the class by talking about a different year, and this year would be 1877. So 1877 is significant for a couple of reasons. So we've already talked about the first reason in our last lecture, which had to do with Reconstruction. So 1877, if you recall, spells the end of radical Reconstruction in the South. You have an election in which you have two candidates. You have Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. You have Rutherford B. Hayes, who's the Republican. It's a fairly tightly contested race. It goes to Congress, and as part of the bargain that's going to help to elect Rutherford B. Hayes, one of the things that they agree upon is that federal troops are going to be removed from the South. State governments in the South, democratically controlled state governments, are going to be the effective power in those states, and radical Reconstruction is essentially over. Okay, without federal troops there to protect the rights of black Southerners, they are at the mercy of the white majority, and the white majority is able to impose a system of white supremacy that lasts for several generations. Now, a second thing that's happening in 1877 is happening further to the north. And what's going on in 1877 in the north is one of the largest labor uprisings in American history. So only a few months after Rutherford B. Hayes took office, rail workers in Martinsburg, Virginia, called a strike to protest against a wage cut. It's actually the third wage cut they had suffered from their employer being the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It's the third one that had been imposed in the past year. Now, part of the background of this strike was the financial panic of 1873, which had plunged the country into depression, prolonged depression. By 1876, you had 14% unemployment. Wages had dropped 25% since 1873. And the depression was felt especially hard in the railroad industry. So railroads by this time were the second biggest employer in the country after agriculture. And railroads are also very capital intensive. It takes a lot of funds in order to build hundreds of miles of railroad tracks. So typically this is done on credit. And so often railroad companies overextend themselves. They find themselves in a credit crunch. And the way in which they are able to make the books balance is by cutting back on costs. And the way to do this typically is by laying off workers or cutting their wages. And so that's why the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company and other railroad companies of the time had cut back on wages in the 1870s. Which takes us back to Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is a small, sleepy little town, but it is important as a railway junction that trains from the Atlantic ports needed to cross in order to access the markets and consumers of the Midwest and the Far West. So knowing its strategic location, the strikers would not allow any of the trains, which were mostly freight trains, to roll until the wage cut was revoked. And so this takes place on July the 14th, 1877. The governor of West Virginia is outraged by this. He's worried about the possible disruption to normal traffic. And acting at the behest of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, he calls in militia units to force the strikers to stand down. But the militiamen, remember they're citizens of West Virginia, have sympathies with the workers, and they refuse to fire upon the strikers. And so then the governor then appeals to the federal government to send in troops to put down the strike by force. Meanwhile, the strike then spreads into neighboring Western Maryland to the major railroad hub of Cumberland, which is one of the railway routes that trains have to take in order to go through the Appalachian Mountains. So it's a crucial railway hub. And there again, railway workers stop freight and they stop passenger traffic. Now it's the governor of Maryland's turn to intervene. He calls up the 5th and 6th regiments from Baltimore, and he orders them to embark upon a train in order to travel to western Maryland. But unfortunately for the militiamen, they're surrounded by citizens of Baltimore who are loyal to the strikers. And as they were trying to board the trains on Camden Street Station, the citizens start to attack them. There's a melee, there are rocks that are thrown, and the militiamen start firing upon the crowd and wind up killing 10 and wounding 15 others. This is probably the worst riot in Maryland since the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. But the rioters don't stand down. They in fact set fire to the train station, they smash the engines of several trains, and by the 20th of July, the militiamen are surrounded, they're holed up in Camden Yards, and they're awaiting reinforcements. And so at this point, once again, the governor turns to the president, and President Hayes sends in federal troops and United States Marines to quell the unrest. But soon the strike spread to other parts of the country, involving not only railroad workers, but sympathetic employees from other industries. It spread to New York City, to Buffalo, to Syracuse, then also to Illinois. There was a general strike in St. Louis. One of the worst strikes that took place was in Pittsburgh, so not too far from Martinsburg, West Virginia, or from Western Maryland. Pittsburgh was both a major industrial center and also a transportation hub, and workers there had been hit especially hard by the Great Depression and by wage cuts. On the other hand, authorities in Pittsburgh were unsympathetic to the plight of the workers. So Thomas Alexander Scott, an executive from the Pennsylvania Railroad, suggested that strikers should be given, quote, a rightful diet for a few days and see how they like that kind of bread. And so, as was the case in other towns, local law enforcement officials are actually quite sympathetic to the strikers and refuse to use violence against them. So again, in the case of Pennsylvania, it's the National Guard that's called in, and the 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry is brought into Pittsburgh. And on July 21st, some members of the National Guard actually bayoneted and fired upon strikers who were throwing rocks and killed 20 of them while wounding 29. But rather than just ending the strike right there, in fact, this infuriated the strikers, who retaliated and forced the National Guard to take refuge in a railroad roadhouse. And then once they were holed up there, the strikers set fire that razed the buildings and destroyed the rolling stock. So you have over 100 locomotives, over 1,000 freight and passenger cars that are destroyed in the fire. The next day, the militiamen decided to fight their way out of the roundhouse and fired upon the strikers, killing 20 more people on the way out of the city. So after a month of all this rioting, all this bloodshed in Pittsburgh, finally the president, once again, sends in federal troops in order to put down the riot. And so remember, these are federal troops who previously, in many cases, had been posted in the South. They'd been posted in the South in order to uphold the rights of African Americans under Reconstruction. Now they're being redeployed to places like Pittsburgh, like Martinsburg, West Virginia, in order to put down a strike. Harper's Weekly, a Republican magazine, in the summer of 1877 described the scene in Pittsburgh. The reporter wrote that loud and deep were the imprecations against the Philadelphia troops, so these National Guardsmen were coming from the port city, the Atlantic port city of Philadelphia, who were blamed by the strikers and the mob as being responsible for the trouble. Hundreds of people in no way connected with the railroad expressed their determination to join with the strikers in driving the soldiers from the city. These remarks were interspersed with loud and bitter threats that the company's shops, depots, and buildings should be laid in ashes that very night, and the rioters kept their word. So this is some of the worst violence in the country since the Civil War, in some ways parallel to the racial violence of the South that whites are engaging in order to strip African Americans of their political rights, and also the violence is taking place in the West, the so-called Indian Wars, in which federal troops are waging war against the indigenous groups of the Great Plains in order to drive them into reservations and open up their homelands to railroads and to homesteaders. So what was the cause of this violence? Why did feelings run so hot? The answer lies in the ways in which American capitalism was being transformed in the decades after the war. Before the war, the United States was still an agrarian country, with some industry but oriented towards household production and agricultural commodities such as cotton, tobacco, wheat, and livestock. So the yeoman ideal was still a realistic goal for most white male Americans. They could still imagine going into the forest and clearing the trees and building an estate that they could in turn pass on to their children. But after the war, the United States developed an industrial economy, fueled by financial speculation and heavily capitalized manufacturing. So there is now a growing chasm of inequality that separated the holders of capital, so the shareholders of railroad companies and other industrial concerns, and the propertyless laborers who depended on wages for their livelihood, the sort of people who would have gone on strike in the summer of 1877. The one sector of the economy that drove this dynamic more than any other was the railroad industry. Before railroads, most transport in the United States was waterborne. If you wanted to carry freight, it had to be by steamboat, or by river, or by ocean, or by canal. You could only trade in places where you found water. But with the advent of railroads in the 1820s, now you had the possibility of overland transport that was rapid and efficient, and which also allowed the market economy to penetrate into places that had previously been isolated. So the railroad boom really began late 1840s, accelerated in the 1850s, but it's the Civil War that is the watershed moment in terms of the expansion of railroads. And it's the federal government that plays a crucial role in that happening. So during the war, Congress authorized charters for several corporations to build a transcontinental railroad that would span the country from Atlantic to Pacific and allow for the development of a single, integrated national market. Note that government involvement was a necessary part of this. Building a railroad line over hundreds of miles was an expensive proposition. Just think of the millions of steel rails laid in long, snaking rows. Think of the tons of explosives necessary to carve tunnels through mountains. And think about the small army of men who were necessary to do all the work that made this possible. And then, once the railway was up and running, think of the tens of thousands of engineers, the coal miners, the railway porters, the telegraph men, the stevedores, who were necessary to keep freight and passengers flowing through the railway network. So all these expenses made railroads very capital intensive. They needed to have a huge pool of capital to begin operations and to keep the business going from one year to the next. And so this was made possible by a new form of business organization that emerges after the Civil War, the business corporation.